Good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar being hosted by the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University on what last week's spending review announced by the Chancellor might mean for the Welsh Budget, and looking forward to the Welsh Budget. We're delighted if you are able to join us. I'm Michael Trickey, an Honorary Research Fellow at the Governance Centre, and will be chairing the event. The webinar comes out of work being undertaken through the Wales Fiscal Analysis programme, part of the Wales Governance Centre, and I'm joined today by Gito Ivan and Kian Sean from the programme, who have been toiling through the Treasury and Welsh Government papers, OBR, forecasts and other sources, and will be presenting their findings in a minute. First of all, some housekeeping. I should say that the event is being recorded for the Welsh Governance Centre archives. Apart from our presenters, everyone's microphones are muted and cameras switched off when they enter the meeting. But we encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves to each other, and to use the Q&A function to ask Gito or Kian questions, either by posting them publicly or by messaging the host. You can welcome to submit questions either in Welsh or English. So to the business. The phrase apparently on every journalist's lips last week after the Chancellor sat down was eye-watering, referring to the extraordinary sums of additional public spending on COVID both this year and next. But as always with budgets and spending reviews, it's only when you look under the surface at the detail that you can move beyond the headlines and understand what is really going on. And here, as we shall hear, the picture is more mixed. Setting the COVID spending aside, there are some real challenges, not only for next year's Welsh budget, but looking further ahead. The mix of COVID, Brexit, the hit on the economy, technical changes through Treasury calculations, and some implicit policy shifts make this an even more complex picture than usual. To help us make some sense of all this, Gito is going to take us through the implications of the spending review and the outlook for the Welsh budget. And then Kian will look at the national and local tax policy in Wales and the implications for that. After the two presentations, we will open up discussion to your questions. Please put your questions as soon as you think of it using the Q&A function. Don't feel you have to wait. Just to say that as well as making the slides available, the underpinning report by Gito and Kian will be published tomorrow on the Welsh Governance Centre website. And that will go into more detail than we can cover today. So I'm going to ask Gito now to lead us off and give his presentation.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Michael, thanks very much, and diolch yn fawr I bawb am ymuno gyda ni bore yma. I'll be covering, as Michael said, the implications of the spending review. Now the dust has settled somewhat on it. While the grim economic outlook, as Michael said, sort of grab the headlines, decisions taken at the spending review will have a significant effect on Wales and the Welsh budget this year, next year, and for years to come. I'll then be covering the Welsh Government's fiscal response, updating some early analysis that we've published on allocations, unallocated funding and spending commitments being made at the moment. Again, this is somewhat of a moving target, but it's perhaps a snapshot of where we think we are at this moment. I'll then be discussing the outlook for the 21-22 budget, looking at different areas of spending and likely pressures, particularly in the context of COVID-19. And finally, I'm going to talk about the outlook beyond 2021-22, or maybe the little that we know about the outlook, and what that potentially means for the Welsh parliamentary elections that are due to be held next May, and the party manifesto plans, which will need to adapt to this outlook. So for the first time at the spending review, we got a glimpse of the UK government's estimates of its planned spending on COVID-19 for this year. So that's around 114 billion pounds of additional public services spending. Health-related spending, as you can imagine, makes up the largest part of that, including a staggering 22 billion pounds for the test and trace system, mainly England's test and trace system, just for context, that's more than the entire Welsh Government budget for day-to-day spending this year, even after its own huge growth in spending. Beyond health, there are smaller allocations for local government, in England, transport services and other public services. In July, the UK government moved away from the Barnett formula in a way to give the devolved governments a funding guarantee for this year. So that was based on a total estimated additional spending on services in England in 2021-22. This provided some greater certainty for the devolved governments, and as they wouldn't need to sort of wait for individual spending announcements to be made for the budgets to be increased this year, as was the case before July. The spending review documents state in a footnote that £2 billion of that funding guarantee has not yet been triggered through the Barnett formula. So this would imply that approved spending in England would need to rise by an additional £10.6 billion for that funding guarantee to be increased again. And that is a possibility, given that if you see there's a COVID reserves put aside for this year of £25.3 billion to allow for additional costs this year. Although the spending review does provide greater clarity, much more than we previously knew about the costs of COVID-19 and public services, it's not really possible to determine which spending programmes here in England have resulted in additional consequentials for Wales. Some areas of spending, such as on vaccine procurement, an element of a portion of the test and trace programme will be UK-wide spending and hence will not result in consequentials. And that makes it difficult to compare directly the fiscal responses of the Welsh Government and the UK Government. So the funding guarantee amounts to £5 billion for this year. £3.3 billion of that is related to public services in England. The UK Government also allocated for the first time additional costs for COVID-19, additional spending for COVID-19 related pressures in 2021-22. And that suggests the UK government assumes that around 40% of this year's COVID-19 spending will carry forward into next year. £34 billion of that pot of money has already been allocated, and that's triggered the £766 million of consequentials for the Welsh Government. This is probably the minimum required really for public services to deal with COVID-19 pressures in Wales. It's likely to be increased significantly, but depending from reserves. A similar share of funding to that already allocated would mean an additional around £660 million for the Welsh Government next year. The spending review claims to provide the devolved administrations with the certainty they need to set their budgets for next year. However, the uncertainty over the size of the Welsh Government's budget, the size of the consequentials coming to the Welsh Government, and probably large in-year revisions are here to stay next year and probably will persist for some years to come. So if you look at the headline figure for consequentials for Wales, it was around £1.3 billion of additional spending for Wales in 2021-22. As I said, £766 million of that was related to COVID-19 consequentials. The day-to-day block grant will increase by £694 million next year to £13.5 billion. That implies a real term increase of approximately 4% in the resource block grant from 2019 to 2021, a 4% per year increase in the block grant. And for the first time, core day-to-day spending by the Welsh Government will be above 2010 in real terms. However, some of that increase over the recent years has been due to farm payments being included in the block grant for the first time and increased public sector pension contributions. And that implies that if you look at this red line, that shows the day-to-day spending on a consistent basis. And that shows that day-to-day spending in the Welsh Budget, or day-to-day funding for the Welsh Budget, will still be slightly below, roughly where it was back in 2010. Of course, on a per-person basis, it will remain significantly below 2010 pre-austerity levels. The Chancellor also revealed indicative plans for the total UK government departmental spending beyond 2021-22, although we don't know what that might mean for the Welsh Block Grant yet. Despite increasing the COVID allocations, you see there the red bars this year and next, penciled in increases to core day-to-day spending was actually cut back by around £10 billion next year, growing to £13 billion in 2024-25. This leaves less room, essentially, for growth in areas not subjected to existing multi-year spending commitment or plans in England, such as for the NHS and schools. And the Chancellor's plans also assume no COVID-19 related pressures beyond 2021-22. I'm not really sure how realistic that will be. For the moment, there were no increases to the pre-COVID-19 multi-year spending plans for the NHS and schools in England, so essentially going back to pre-COVID spending plans, despite the obvious increasing demands which would be placed on these services over coming years. That suggests a bleaker outlook, perhaps, for the Welsh budget over the medium term than we were expecting. It also sort of sets the context for the public sector pay freeze announced for non-NHS workers last week. If we return to the consequential graphs for Wales then, and look at the capital side of the budget, that actually, the capital block grant will be cut in nominal terms next year, because traditional capital funding will grow by only £60 million, while financial transactions spending will be falling by £191 million. That means the Welsh Government's capital funding will increase by 2% in real terms from 2019 to 2021. That's despite the UK government's total capital del growing substantially from 70 billion to nearly 100 billion over the same time. Part of that discrepancy between the Welsh and UK government growth in the capital budget is explained by reprofiling of Barnett consequentials. £100 million cut to the Welsh budget was delayed from 2019 to 2020. After correcting for that adjustment to the baseline, if you like, the capital funding will grow by 7% in real terms from 2019 to 2021-22. That's still significantly below the increase in the UK government's capital budget. Some of the other spending announcements in the budget I'll go through quickly. If you look at the Shared Prosperity Fund, we got some more detail on that. It's set to replace the EU structural funding from next year. However, the allocated spending for the Shared Prosperity Funding next year falls well short of expectations. Funding for the whole of the UK is just £220 million next year. That compares to average allocations of around £375 million a year just for Wales under the EU structural funding. The spending review commits to ramping up that spending to £1.5 billion. While this eventually will match the EU funding receipts on average from previous years, it will still fall short of actual allocations through those programmes, as well as match funding that the UK government would have provided in the past. The Conservative Party 2019 manifesto stated that the Shared Prosperity Fund would at a minimum match the size of EU funds in each nation. And rather implausibly, really, that would entail, to meet that commitment, it would entail Wales getting over a quarter of all funding from that fund when it eventually reaches its full budget. And questions, of course, remain around the administration of the fund and the role of devolved governments. The role of devolved governments is also mentioned in the National Infrastructure Strategy, where the UK government states that it wants to use the powers that it has that it would be given if the UK Internal Market Bill goes through, to spend directly in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Details really on the nature and the size of what that might entail for Wales are obviously unclear. It should be noted, however, that the UK government's record of investing in Wales under the areas already under its competence is quite poor. Wales receives much less than a population share in capital, rail transport, for instance, and science and technology spending. And the next thing I want to mention is a technical point, but the spending reviews, accompanying spending reviews, the Treasury publishes a statement of funding policy, and these technical documents set out the policies and procedures which govern the UK government's funding for the devolved governments. This year's publication is notable since the last update was provided in 2015 before the significant changes in the fiscal frameworks of both Wales and Scotland. However, the rules governing borrowing and the use of reserves hasn't been changed, even though the circumstances since the fiscal framework agreements were reached in 2016 has changed dramatically. So I think that's a lost opportunity. There's also new comparability factors. These capture, essentially, they're used in the Barnett formula to capture the extent to which services delivered by UK government departments by the UK government departments correspond to services delivered by the devolved governments. The Welsh government's comparability factor for the Department for Transport has dropped significantly from 81% to 37%, mainly because of HS2 and the reclassification of Network Rail as part of the Department for Transport's budget, and that's included in the Barnett calculations, if you like, for the first time, and that's meant this comparability factor has dropped significantly. That means that for every increase in spending by the Department for Transport, less money is passed on to the Welsh Government budget. I don't really want to go into the detailed argument of whether this should have been or should not have been the case, but I do want to point out that this will have a material effect on the Welsh budget over the next 5 years and beyond. Although we don't have sort of firm spending plans from the Department for Transport, we do have some multi-year allocations, so that we use that to project Department for Transport spending forward to 2025-26, and making assumptions about its spending not covered by the multi-year plans. So of course, a very broad estimate. But if you move to a system where HS2 was classed as an England-only project and Network Rail was treated outside of the Department for Transport's budget, as it was in the past and as it will be the case in Scotland, that would mean around £505 million of additional spending increase, of additional consequentials passed on to the Welsh budget over the course of that 5 years. And that perhaps is something that will be sort of raise its head ahead of the next spending review when the multi-year plans will be set by the UK government. So now I want to turn to the Welsh Government's fiscal response so far. Since the final budget plans, the spending of the Welsh Government has changed dramatically. It's worth noting that supplementary budgets are usually quite technical documents that don't really change that much from final budget plans, especially before February of a financial year. This year, of course, the growth has been spectacular in terms of the additional consequentials being added to the Welsh budget. That'll mean that final budget plans will be increased by around 25% by the end of the year, based on current figures. The Welsh Government's fiscal response obviously has been funded mainly by the COVID-19 consequentials, but also with it reprioritised funding from within its own budget. That total pot, if you like, available for the Welsh Government's fiscal response is around £5.6 billion. It's allocated around £4 billion of that so far in the supplementary budgets. That includes £1.7 billion for businesses and grants, reliefs and loans, and a 17% increase in the health and social services budget, including the latest £800 million stabilisation fund for the NHS. That also includes the devolved element of test and trace, currently budgeted around £118 million this year, and additional support for local authority budgets of around £500 million, and that's close to around 11% of what its aggregate external finance was at the start of based on final budget allocations. There's also, if you see the bottom bar there, a striking amount of unallocated funding in the budget. And if we go through, or look at the £5 billion COVID consequentials, we can say that about £3.3 billion of that has been allocated already, with the rest being allocated being funded through other sources. It was around £1 billion on top of those allocations in the second supplementary budget that was left unallocated. That mainly reflects the fact that some of the increase in the funding guarantee, or the consequentials announced, came late in October, of around £400 million. The UK government has since the publication of the second supplementary budget, the UK government has announced a further £600 million for the Welsh Government budget. And that means there would be approximately £1,600 million of COVID-19 funding to allocate in supplementary budgets before the end of the year. That's on top of around £100 million, which were unallocated in existing plans already. So the Welsh Government itself, since publishing the draft budget, has made policy and spending announcements since October that haven't been yet outlined in detail. This includes a £300 million commitment for a COVID-19 reconstruction package, which we haven't seen the details of as of yet. It was a big increase, or money of it being made available for businesses during the firebreak lockdown of around £300 million. We don't really know how much of that is additional, but based on what was paid out from previous rounds of the Economic Resilience Fund, we estimate that around £60 million of that would be on top of original budget allocations, but that might be quite a way off. Other significant funding commitments included the self-isolation payment scheme, and more recently on Monday, the £340 million increase in support for businesses through the Economic Resilience Fund to support businesses through the latest set of restrictions to come into place on Friday. If all of those sort of additional spending announcements were indeed additional to the budget, that would mean that they combined to around £800 million. That would leave around £800 million uncommitted in the budget. So yeah, that seems a plausible estimate of how much remains uncommitted now by the Welsh Government. Of course, there's uncertainties around that, and this unallocated funding does reflect the unprecedented uncertainties that the Welsh Government faces for the remainder of this financial year. And of course, recall on a comparable basis, the UK government itself hasn't allocated around £600 million of that COVID funding guarantee. It's worth noting, even in normal years, it's not uncommon for around 2 to 5% of the budget to be unallocated until the usual second supplementary budget in February. This year, the cost and demand pressures on public services are much more uncertain. The economic context and the need for further business support is also highly uncertain. Future periods of tight restrictions in the new year would need to coincide with more grant funding for affected businesses. And this uncertainty is magnified by inflexible budget arrangements, as we've argued in the past. The Welsh Government will be unable to borrow to cover overspending in this financial year, or can't overborrow to sort of commit to additional funding. This means the Welsh Government may need to keep back unallocated funding to respond to unforeseen spending pressures late in the financial year. This also impairs the Welsh Government's ability to make open-ended commitments, such as the commitments being made by the UK Government to businesses in England, depending on the level of restrictions in place in their areas. There are also restrictions on the use of the Welsh Government's use of the Wales Reserve, which haven't been updated to reflect this sort of increased uncertainties. If the Welsh Government, conversely, if the Welsh Government underspends relative to the increase in its budget this year, we think it'll be restricted in the amounts of funding it'll be able to carry forward to future years. And given the projected position of the Wales Reserve at the end of the last year, and the maximum the Welsh Government could carry forward under the current rules, would be around £138 million. And that's important because the Welsh Government may wish to carry forward more funding, given the outlook for the budget. On the 21st of December, the draft budget will be published with arguably less information about the likely size of the Welsh budget, as well as eventual spending pressures, than ever before. But nevertheless, crucial decisions will need to be made. So if I quickly go through sort of the outlook for day-to-day spending, we assume that tax policy remains unchanged, and the Welsh Government draws down again from the £125 million from the Wales Reserve next year. So there's no changes in the fiscal framework built into these assumptions. On the capital DAL, we assume that the Welsh Government borrow the full allocation of £150 million next year. But even so, the capital budget decreases slightly in cash terms from next year. The one crucial question is how the Welsh Budget will cope with COVID-19 spending costs next year. Available funding from the UK government relating to COVID-19 only equates to around 14% of the funding available for the Welsh Government's fiscal response this year, unless that commitment on the UK government changes. So this shows the Welsh Government's fiscal response by different categories this year, based on what we think the additional commitments made since the second supplementary budget was announced mean. To provide an illustrative allocation of the next year's COVID consequentials, we first assume that funding will only be used to meet public services as per the UK government's plans that have triggered those consequentials. This would imply additional spending on public services falling by over 2/3 by the Welsh Government next year. It would mean around £428 million for the NHS and £61 million for the Health and Social Services budget. This funding would need to meet additional costs relating to PPE next year, as well as the Welsh Government's Test, Trace, Protect programme. A population-based equivalent of the UK government's NHS recovery package would take up around £170 million of that allocation. This would leave £166 million for local government budgets, down from £500 million this year. Although these are obviously hypothetical allocations, it does go to show that COVID-19 pressures next year it's going to be a challenge for the Welsh Government to meet these COVID-19 spending pressures next year, given the current allocation from the UK government. And under current plans, it's likely a significant portion of COVID-19 related costs will need to be met from within the Welsh Government's own budget. Of course, under this scenario, again, the Welsh Government would not allocate any funding for business rates, reliefs or grants. And this would be a huge reduction in support for businesses from the Welsh Government this year. As ever, one of the most significant budgetary decisions would be how much to allocate for the NHS, which accounts for about a half of the Welsh Government's day-to-day spending. Allocations made to health spending has a substantial effect on the remainder of the budget, or how much is available for the rest of the budget. As a benchmark scenario, we assume the increase in core resource spending for the NHS per person matches the increase in England. That would mean approximately £350 million of additional day-to-day spending for the NHS. That would leave a significant share of the total increase in the Welsh budget for other services of around £590 million. Of course, the pressures on the NHS that will probably exceed those allocations. If you think about if productivity is 5% lower due to the sort of higher costs, that would entail £400 million additional costs for the NHS. There is, of course, a significant backlog of patients who weren't treated in the spring and potentially over this winter, as well as new demands such as notably on mental health. If we take the Health Foundation's estimate of the gap, if you like, in funding from the spending review for the NHS in England, that would mean an additional £340 million next year for the NHS. However, that would mean far less for the rest of the budget, of course, that themselves are facing huge pressures next year, COVID and otherwise. So if you look at survey and modelling carried out by the Local Government Association, they project underlying pressures of around £279 million next year, mainly due to workforce costs, but also demand pressures from social care and inflationary pressures. School spending, the Luke Subietta's works projected that school costs per learner would grow by around 8% over the next 3 years. However, that didn't cover the potential COVID-19 related costs in schools and the need for catch-up spending for Welsh schools to deal with the effects of this year on educational outcomes and inequality. And you can't, of course, ignore where these services were before we went into the crisis. Spending on older age social care, for instance, has been flat for over a decade, despite the growing older population. Spending per pupil was around 6%. School spending per pupil was about 6% below where it was before austerity. And overall local government support from the Welsh Government was already around 14% lower than 2010, despite recent increases. A key part of the economic response support being offered to the Welsh economy this year has been provided through the Welsh Government budget, as I mentioned, around £2.1 billion of grants released and loans now, we think, being made available to businesses. Barring significant changes in the flow of consequentials this year, the prospect of similar support being provided next year is unlikely. And given the deteriorating economic outlook, for instance, on unemployment, that is a concern. A key part of the recovery, again, would be the capital infrastructure spending by the Welsh Government. And on this, if you look at although there were no firm plans for capital spending for the Welsh Government for beyond next year, if you look at an illustrative projection of the capital budget, you can see a very slow growth in the Welsh capital budget, but not a substantial growth, and far below the growth that we're expecting in the overall UK government capital budget next year. So finally, on that point, I want to go back to the day-to-day spending and look at the outlook for the Welsh budget over the next Welsh parliamentary term. So we obviously don't know the UK government's detailed spending plans. We don't know what the size of the Welsh Block grant will be, but some areas of spending are covered by multi-year commitments, notably schools and health consequentials, not notably health and the NHS, health and school spending in England. Presumably, detailed plans would be published next year, but the indicative spending plans laid out in the spending review sets the context really for the Welsh parliamentary elections in May, and may have implications for the feasibility of manifesto commitments and tax policy options. From 2022-23, this is a projection based on those indicative spending plans. You can see that the increase in the Welsh budget is really being driven by health consequentials and schools consequentials, and there's no really contribution from other areas of spending in England. What that means for the Welsh budget, it means that the Welsh Government budget is set to grow over the course of the next Welsh Parliament under these projections, something like 1.5% in real terms from this next year, 2025-26. But that means that spending will be around 4% higher than pre-austerity levels by 2024-25 on a consistent like-for-like basis. However, even by the middle of the next parliamentary term, per person spending on a consistent basis will still be lower than 2010 levels. And if consequentials from health spending in England are passed on to the Welsh NHS over these years, this could leave non-NHS day-to-day spending in the Welsh budget still around 8% below pre-austerity levels, even by the middle of the next Welsh parliamentary term. So just some final thoughts from myself. I think it's clear that the huge uncertainties faced by the Welsh budget this year are here to stay, and arguably the Welsh Government doesn't have the tools to deal with that uncertainty adequately. Despite the huge spending in COVID-19 this year and next, the future spending plan suggests quite a tight picture for public services in the face of what will be huge spending pressures. The current budget, the current plans of the UK government aren't realistically going to tackle the huge effects of the crisis. And I think the effects of this year on the budget would be seen for many years, of course, and the austere look for spending sets the context for the manifesto commitments of the parties next year. And on that note, I think this more austere prospect for the Welsh budget over the coming years, we really need to have a debate around tax policies in Wales and what level of public services we want and how we pay for them, which brings me nicely on to Cian's presentation. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thanks, Guto, very much. just to say again that there's a lot of information there, a lot of detail, but we will be publishing the full report tomorrow. So I'm now going to pass over to Kian to talk about the tax side. We've been talking about the spending side, and now we need to just look at the tax side and where Wales's developing tax powers might take us. Kian.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Gito, Michael, and bore da chi gyd. So for the last section of today's presentation, I'm going to focus on Welsh tax policy. I'll begin by talking about how trends in earnings and employment have affected the OBR's latest forecasts for the devolved taxes. I'll discuss what these forecasts mean for the Welsh Government spending power for 2021-22 and beyond. Third, I'm going to touch on local taxes, so effectively how might COVID-19 affect local tax revenues, and also what are some of the implications for local authority budgets going forwards. And lastly, I will talk briefly about the tax policy options available for the Welsh Government, particularly, as you heard from Gito, in the context of next year's elections and the broader outlook for the Welsh Budget. But I'm going to begin with these pair of charts, and these use real-time pay-as-you-earn data from HMRC to track the number of payroll employees and the average pay award by geographic region. So they might need a bit of explaining. The lines in red represent Wales, the grey lines represent Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the 9 NUTS1 regions of England. The charts have been indexed to April 2019 when income tax was first devolved. And now, since the bulk of devolved income tax revenues are paid through pay-as-you-earn, this is actually a pretty good indicator of whether devolved tax revenues are likely to be relatively more affected or less affected than the UK average by the COVID-19 economic shock. And you can see on the left chart quite a pronounced fall in the number of employees in March, April, so that by July there were around 25,000 fewer employees in Wales on the payroll. But actually after that initial reduction, things have flattened out. The number of employees on the payroll have sort of remained broadly stable since then at around 2% below their pre-COVID levels. And that would suggest actually that most furloughed employees have in fact been kept on. Two more things that I think are quite striking. First, you might be surprised that we don't see a larger fall in average pay. Average pay has already surpassed its pre-COVID levels, though admittedly we have to pay attention to the fact that if much of the job shedding has impacted lower paid workers, then that could have also driven up the average pay award in the process. And secondly, the geographic impact appears to be remarkably uniform, at least across these large NUTS1 geographies, which is what we're looking at here. There is some evidence from benefits data to suggest there may be some more variance at a local authority level. But that story of a relatively uniform impact across the largest geographies of the UK, that's also told by some alternative indicators of economic activity. So here we have a chart comparing visits to retail and recreational spaces in Wales and the UK, comparing it with the pre-COVID baseline. And what you can see here is that Wales and the UK followed a similar path into lockdown, a similar path during the summer's reopening. There has, of course, been more divergence in recent months, but you would expect now that those lines start to converge again as England exits its lockdown and the new restrictions come into force in Wales. Now, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, they agree that there is little evidence to suggest that income tax liabilities in Wales are expected to be hit by more or less than the UK average due to the pandemic. And what this means essentially is that any revisions since the last forecast in March will by and large reflect the UK-wide hit to tax revenues. So I'm going to run through each of those in turn. Land transaction tax, the successor of stamp duty in Wales, revenues for that tax are expected to fall by a third this year compared to last year, and that will reflect the shutdown of the property market in Wales in the early months of the pandemic, and also the subsequent decision to implement a tax holiday. You can see that revenues are expected to remain slightly depressed for the next 2 years, and that's due to a UK-wide forecast decline in property values, and also some forestalling effect as well. So Effectively, the OBR have assumed that around 1,000 transactions which would have taken place next year are being brought forward to this year to take advantage of that tax holiday. So we might expect to see a lower volume of transactions in the early months of the next financial year. Revenue from landfill disposal tax is forecast to be 27% lower this year, though recovering quite quickly. This is, of course, the smallest of the devolved taxes. And devolved income tax revenues are forecast to grow this year, perhaps surprisingly, but fall next year. And the central OBR forecast also projects that unemployment will peak at 7.5% next year. So that fall in income tax is likely to coincide with that peak in unemployment. And even though the income tax revenues do eventually resume their pre-COVID trajectory, if you look towards the forecast horizon, you can see that revenues are set to be around £200 million lower than what was previously forecast in March. But if you've been to one of our fiscal events before, you'll probably know by now that the Welsh tax forecasts only tell us a part of the story. And in order to understand what this means for the Welsh budget, we also need to consider the block grant adjustments. So whereas revenue raised by the devolved taxes increase the Welsh Government spending power, the block grant adjustments reduce it. And those block grant adjustments will reflect the in-year change in comparable per person tax revenue in England and Northern Ireland. So without going too much into the detail, if per person devolved tax revenue grows quicker in Wales than England and Northern Ireland, that will have a positive impact on the Welsh Government's budgets. But if tax revenues in Wales grow at a relatively slower pace, then that deduction to the block grants will exceed the tax revenues raised, and that will have a negative impact on the Welsh budget. So what does the forecast say is going to happen? Well, the grey line plots the net effect over the OBR forecast period. You can see that in 2021-22, the adjustment for the devolved taxes is forecast to exceed the tax raised by around £40 million. Now, in the context maybe of some of the figures you heard from Gito earlier, that might not seem like a lot, but it's certainly not an insubstantial amount, particularly if the devolved budgets are squeezed in future years. The biggest determinant of that is income tax in green. So essentially the OBR are forecasting that as a share of total English and Northern Irish income tax, the Welsh share of income tax will decline over the next few years due to slower population growth. They're now using updated population projections from the ONS, which make different assumptions about a slower rate of population growth for Wales going forwards. Of course, that picture is very likely to change with future forecast revisions, and especially once the first year of out-turn data becomes available. Having said that, this chart does still matter, because the Welsh Government will set their 2021-22 draft spending plans based on these set of forecasts. So basically, they will have to account for that larger than expected deduction to the block grants when they're setting out their overall spending powers. For LTT and LDT, the smaller taxes, if there's any change in the forecast during the next financial year, the Welsh Government will be able to account for that in their supplementary budgets. But for income tax, these forecasts are fixed at the beginning of the financial year. So effectively, any difference between the forecast and the outturn will not be resolved until the reconciliation exercise. And that can only occur after the outturn data has been made available, normally around 15 months after the end of the financial year. So what that means is that basically the outturn data for devolved income tax in 21-22 will not become available until summer 2023, and then the reconciliations being applied for the Welsh Government's budget in 2024-25, so which is quite a long lag in a way. So at least in the short term, these forecasts are arguably much more important than the outturn in determining the Welsh Government's spending power. In terms of how that income tax revenue is split across different bands, you can see that the Welsh tax base is still heavily skewed towards basic rate payers, although the COVID shock does appear to have hit basic rate revenue slightly harder than the higher and the additional rates. If you were to put a penny on the basic rate of income tax, based on next year's figures, that would raise around £180 million for the Welsh budget. If you were to put a penny on the higher rates, around £25 million could be raised. and around £5 million on the additional rates of income tax. In July, of course, the Welsh Government made some temporary changes to the LTT tax schedule, and that followed on from the UK Government's decision to implement a stamp duty holiday there. So in Wales, that 0% threshold was extended from 180,000 to 250,000, and the OBR estimates that around 10,000 transactions will benefit from that at a cost of around £18 million. Of course, in addition to the devolved taxes, revenues from local taxes, council tax and non-domestic rates are also expected to be impacted by the economic downturn. The way that in-year tax collection interacts with the amount available to finance expenditure for local authorities is not immediately intuitive, but basically if collection rates turn out to be lower than originally budgeted this year, that will only impact the amount available to spend next year in 2021-22. However, if we're looking at historical data from the 2008 crisis, there is some evidence to suggest that labour market shocks might only have a marginal impact on collection rates. And that's probably because many people who find themselves losing their primary source of income, they might still be eligible for a reduction to their bills anyway through the council tax reduction scheme. The UK Chancellor has announced a scheme for English local authorities to spread the cost of repaying any deficits on the council tax collection fund over 3 years instead of the usual 1 year. So there may be a case for giving similar discretion to Welsh local authorities. And also since March, the Welsh Government have announced an additional £5.5 million to cover additional demand pressures on the council tax reduction scheme. We don't quite know yet what the additional take-up of the scheme will be this year and how that will match up with the additional spending allocated. Another thing we looked at, given the increased discussion on second home ownership recently, we've estimated the amount of additional revenue brought in by the second home premium for each local authority this year. You can see that 8 local authorities have opted to levy a premium on second homes. Gwynedd, Pembrokeshire, Powys, Denbighshire and Flintshire levying a premium of 50%, Ynys-Môn 35% and Ceredigion and Conwy 25%. Now in the grand scheme of things, £8 million is a relatively small amount of revenue that's being raised this way, but it has become an increasingly important source of funding. For some local authorities, you can see Gwynedd there raising an additional £3 million from its application of the premium, which is just under 1% of its gross revenue expenditure. The Welsh Government will also have some decisions to make about non-domestic rates. So the UK Government has announced that the multiplier used to calculate businesses' tax liability will be frozen next year, instead of uprating it as they usually do in line with inflation. Now, if the Welsh Government decided to follow suit, that would mean that there would be less revenue in the central pool to redistribute to local authorities in 22-23. Another way that NDR revenues could be impacted is if the Valuations Office agency grants businesses a temporary reduction in their rateable value because of COVID. So businesses can usually submit a cheque to the VOA if the rateable value of their property has been impacted by a material change of circumstances. So in the pre-COVID normal times, a shop owner might successfully appeal if he or she could prove that roadworks had significantly impacted their turnover, for instance. And you can see that from this chart, there was a sharp increase in the amount of businesses submitting a cheque on their valuations to the VOA in the first quarter of this financial year, a 6-fold increase in the previous quarter. We don't know yet whether the VOA will classify COVID-19 to be a material change of circumstances, but if they do, that could also have a small impact on the size of the NDR pool for next year. And lastly, this is something we've talked about in previous events, but I think it's worth revisiting because this chart shows the impact on households of a 4.8% increase in council tax, so essentially the average increase in Wales last year. Now, there's a strong argument that council tax needs reform. It's regressive with respect to income and property values, and the large increases to bills over the last decade means that it's become an ever larger chunk of household expenditure. And although you can see from the graphs, the poorest quintile are protected to some extent by the council tax reduction scheme. You can see from the chart on the right that actually across the board, richer households pay less in council tax as a share of their household income. And although the UK Chancellor didn't announce any tax rises last week, he did decide to loosen the restrictions on the social care precept and how much council tax in England can rise next year. And that will mean that households in England will almost inevitably see a higher tax bill. And if the aim, is to shield households who have been most adversely impacted by COVID, then really he couldn't have opted for a worse way of raising additional revenue. And I think there's a lesson here for Wales as well, because if that choice is between raising the devolved rates of income tax to adequately fund public services or leaving them unchanged and leaving local authorities to raise council tax to make up the shortfall, then the former choice is by far the most progressive choice with respect to income. Of course, the Welsh Government have a manifesto commitment not to increase income tax this Senate term, but I think it should be something for all parties to consider for the next Senate term, particularly given the medium-term outlook that Gito just outlined, which suggests that the devolved budgets will once again be squeezed. And the good news, or the slightly more good news, is that the basic rate of income tax is a very progressive way of raising devolved revenue, particularly with respect to income, because essentially the lower income households are protected by the personal allowance, whereas the richer households pay more, both in absolute terms and as a share of their income. Now, ideally, you might want to rethink council tax altogether, and I know there's been very good pieces of work published recently on what the alternatives might be in Wales. But I think in the meantime, the ability to increase income tax does allow you to fund higher levels of spending in a progressive way, or it does allow you as well to shield households from less progressive elements of the reserved tax system and local taxes as well. And on that cheery subject of tax rises, I'm going to bring my presentation to a close, and I think we have time for some questions from the audience. Thank you. Diolch.
Thanks very much, Kian. I'm conscious that we have covered a lot of ground and a lot of detail, and that simply reflects the kind of complexity of the situation in terms of fiscal policy that we face. So I apologize that we've had to go into such detail, but as I say, the issues are involved and complicated. And just to say again that we'll be publishing the written report which covers the ground we've covered in the presentations today. We'll be publishing the written report on the implications of the spending review for the Welsh Budget and the outlook for the Welsh Budget and associated tax issues. We're publishing that tomorrow, and that will go cover the ground and go into a bit more detail. So there's a very limited time for some questions. I've had one question. If you have anybody else has any questions, please use your Q&A function to let me have them. The question I've been asked is refers back to a statement from the Welsh Government Centre from the team when they suggest there might be a typographical error in the Treasury's statement of funding with regard to transport. Do they still, is that still the view that there was a typographical mistake in the Treasury's original publication?
Yeah, so there was one, it was about £10 billion missing from one table on network rail spending, which complicated the issue, and that was corrected on the day in the statement, in the new statement of funding policy, which was released later on, when was it, last Wednesday. There's still maybe a slight inconsistency that we think that's in how network rail funding is classed in the comparability factor. The spending sort of included in the calculations of the comparability factor for network rail, which is applied at a 0% program level comparability factor. That funding included in that calculation is higher than what's included in the DEL figures for the demand for transport, but we're not sure why that's the case. I think the general point is, of course, that transport spending on rail infrastructure spending is a non-devolved issue. So it's, this is the way that the Treasury is deemed to to make the calculation and to apply the Barnett formula. However, so the Welsh Government's figures on the historic rail underinvestment that Wales has seen makes a persuasive case for why this shouldn't have been the case in the Barnett formula, and how Wales should have been getting a greater share of Department for Transport's consequentials over coming years, since it is investing its own money into the rail infrastructure in Wales. So there's a whole host of other sort of political arguments to be made, as well as the technical issues that we raised last week.
Thank you. We have another question, and it's, do you think that we will see proposals to increase income tax in the election manifestos? So a bit of crystal ball there. And then a second question, which I'll give you what I can. So what's your guess about the future in terms of political commitments on income tax? And then the kind of prospects for public sector pay within the context of the spending review, and how much that's likely to impact on spending pressures over the coming year.
Yeah, so I mean, on the income tax question, I mean, obviously increasing taxes is always difficult, but I think it's worth making the point that, you know, not everyone would necessarily be worse off if you were to increase income tax. You know, if that translates into better public services, and you can get that message across the electorate, then, you know, some households may well be better off, and that's particularly the case given that around 45%, I believe, of individuals in Wales don't pay any income tax at all because of that personal allowance. I can understand the difficulty with sort of making that case. There might be a case for sort of a soft hypothecation of any increase in income tax. There is some evidence to suggest that people, or the electorate, might be more willing to accept tax rises if they know what that tax is going on. So, you know, the Welsh Government could say perhaps that, you know, to deal with social care pressures or to increase education spending, we are increasing the basic rate of income tax by a certain amount. But I think it's also worth stressing that, you know, if you want to maintain the levels of spending on public services, if the alternative is an increase to council tax bills, that's likely to affect a much wider group of people than if you were to propose an increase in income tax. And those group of people that would be affected by a council tax rise would include the very poorest households. I think it's probably just getting the message out more than anything, so that people understand more. Maybe because income tax is a payroll tax, we are slightly more aware of it because we see it on the payslip. But at least in the grand scheme of things, when you look at things in the round, certainly increasing the rate of income tax in Wales would be a very progressive way of funding public services.
If I can add on that point, I think opinion polls show that more voters now want higher levels of public services spending and higher taxes, or are willing to accept higher levels of taxes for that. It'll be interesting to see, and I think we'll hopefully we do have some more data next year ahead of the election on whether that applies in Wales, and whether Welsh voters will accept higher levels of taxation at a devolved level as well as on the UK level. On public sector pay, it was something that was in my presentation, but I skipped over for time. So there is more information on that, or more analysis on that in the report that we'll be publishing tomorrow. It's obviously one of the big parts of the spending pressures that local governments face going forward. So the Chancellor's announcements apply to the sort of 120,000 local government employees in Wales. I think that it was sort of justified. It's going to reduce the spending costs, but it's also going to potentially impact recruitment in the public sector, and sort of, for instance, the social care sector. It's going to have sort of big implications on the ability to recruit, especially in the context of potential changes involved with the EU end of the EU transition period. in January as well. So yeah, there's more on that in our report tomorrow.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, both. We're out of time now. Thank you very much for the presentations. I hope everyone's found that helpful and interesting. Look out for the report tomorrow. And thank you very much, so much for joining us. And goodbye.